Despite none of the questions almost being about queerness, I feel like I'm a raging queer, so I'll briefly mention that Pratchett and the female man are like phenomenally inspiring and useful for myself.
Probably my favourite science fiction book ever.
It's
I've
so
been
it's
reading
so
it over and
good.
over again for years.
I especially love the parataxis in it and
Yeah.
the use of like clear cut language, which reminds me of a book by Bernardino Evaristo that we've been looking at.
Interesting. I like her work.
It's weirdly familiar. Like it's very direct. I'll go to a page and it will be a very clear cut fact of what's happening.
It's one of the things I talk about in the book I've just today sent off to readers. I've been working on it for 4 years, way, way, way too long.
In reference to your Rhetorics of Fantasy, are there any ways the four rhetorics have changed? Do you still consider them and their dictats applicable?
They aren't diktats. They are what I saw,
Yeah.
and other people might see it differently. When I wrote the book, I was still in a history department. By the time it came out, I was in a creative writing department. And one of the big shocks was the degree to which this book was taken up by creative writers. I was stunned. And literature people didn't take to it in anything like the same way. So it's not so much that they're diktats, they're ways of thinking about how rhetoric works and how the ideology of what you're writing is bound up with rhetoric. But if you write in a certain way, you will shape certain expectations. That may limit what you do. So I had a PhD student called Christopher Owen, from whom I learned a great deal. This is after I wrote Rhetorics. And his book is on cognitive scripts and looking very specifically cognitive scripts in children's fantasy. And he took on something that for me is almost a throwaway comment in rhetoric, which is that you can write a book with an apparently liberationist argument, but that if the rhetoric you use doesn't support that, you won't have written a liberationist book. And I think I came up with this idea because I never liked the Harry Potter books. And I don't know if you've read my 2003 article on Harry Potter, but I was well ahead of the curve on this one. I got quite a lot of angry comments about the article. But I basically pointed out that for all the whole we're the nice people and Voldemort are the bad people, this was a world in which denoming was acceptable, half-breeds weren't allowed ones, Hagrid is treated like dirt, and the list goes on and on.
It reminds me of Tolkien in a way that it's like good versus evil.
It's more than that. It's in some ways, Harry Potter is more truthful, because if you want to think of the Second World War, most of the so-called good sides were imperial powers. It's only as we get older and read more subtle forms of history and more detailed history that we realize that the powers who are supposedly fighting for freedom are America, who treats African Americans terribly, Britain, who'd only just finished bombing the shit out of its Indian subjects. You can be saying one thing while doing another. And I think I might have spent more time on that.
As I've been writing satire, it's kind of fallen apart where I'm not following a genre structure.
Right.
And I've been trying to follow along with your idea of rhetorics, and it's helped narrow it, which makes me actually make a point.
One thing you can always think about, though, is how to break the things I say. How can you do it differently? Because I would hate it if 100 years from now, my book was still relevant. I would like
Absolutely.
it to.
I love the point you made about the female man and how it's outdated because we've progressed, which is a good thing.
And in other ways, it's not, which is depressing.
Exactly, yeah.
But just to finish this question, the one thing I didn't do was to talk about the endings of books. And one of these days, I might write an extra chapter to think about that. How do these rhetorics affect the kind of endings books have? I think Portal Quest fantasies end far more and more conclusively than the other rhetorics. Intrusion fantasies seem to spawn endless sequels. So I might want to go back and look at that one day.
How do you feel modern urban life impacts the fantasy genre?
God, I don't think I can answer that question. But no, for the very specific reason that I'm not terribly up to date. I'm currently a judge for the Historical Crime Fiction Award, and that's like 150 books a year. I'm not sure it does, in that most urban fantasy is historical fantasy. The period in which urban life really affected the fantasy genre runs roughly between the 50s and the early 80s, when we had some absolutely lovely books, often children's books. Dana Wynne Jones, a lovely writer called Barbara Slay, a lot of people who were writing social realism set in the urban environment. Now, if I'm trying to think of modern writers who do that, somebody like Narlow Hopkinson does it. Her book Chaos is set in modern Toronto, as is her first book, Brown Girl in the Ring, is future Toronto. Chaos is modern Toronto. To the degree that there are writers doing it, they tend to be people of color and with other marginalizations. There's a lovely book that came out yes, I think last year, and I'm sorry, you're just going to have to go research it because I forgot the title. But some aliens land on Earth, take over a donut shop, and one of them becomes involved with a violinist who has been trained by the queen, by the sacrifice to the Queen of the Fairies as her replacement to take her place at the 7 yearly timed TIEND. And I can't think of the name of the book, and it's just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And it's dealing with issues of migration, otherness, refugee status, the experience of being trans, the experience of being phenomenally talented. It's a wonderful book. So I think a lot of very modern contemporary urban life is way more likely to turn up in fantasy by those writers who are exploring the intersection of the fantastic and the marginalized experience. But that really is off the top of my head. I've just not read enough recently. At the moment, I probably don't read more than about 12 fantasy books a year, whereas before I took on the Dagger Award, it would be more like 50.
That's still an outrageous amount for myself. I can barely focus on a single book.
Don't fret, honestly. I've always been what I took to calling an extreme sport reader. It's just one of those things. I don't watch a lot of TV or film. So where other people are gaming or playing TV or watching, books is what I do. So it's just one of those things. One should never feel good or bad about them.
Yeah.
Okay, Pratchett. Honestly, the Vimes books, top of the list, of course, has got to be Nightwatch.
My friend introduced me to him because she read my book and was immediately like, okay, you're just copying Pratchett. And I was like, who's that? Well, now I've read Equal Rights and Guards, and they're phenomenal. And I think he presents Ankh-Morpork as very ironically mimetic way. It seems realistic despite it being so fantastical. So where does Pratchett succeed in writing satirical history within Ankh-Morpork?
I think Nightwatch is the obvious one. Nightwatch is a bit about the French Revolution, a bit about the English Civil War, although that never made it into London. It's certainly about revolutionaries generally. But have you seen a TV program called Citizen Smith?
No.
Oh, take a look at Citizen Smith. You can find it on YouTube. And Citizen Smith was made in the early years of the Thatcher regime.
Oh, that sounds
in
really
somewhere like
interesting.
Islington. I can't remember now. And Citizen Smith is a kind of ultra left wing. He is Red Shoe.
What's Red Shoe?
Reginald Shoe is the zombie in the Vimes books, but in Nightwatch, he's a young radical who thinks he's a revolutionary. And he is quite obviously Citizen Smith. I can't think of anything else for Thermod, except maybe Small Gods, which is all about the history of religions. You know, how do we get to religions in the shape they are? Small Gods is my all-time favorite.
In what way, if any, are feudal setups limiting fantasy?
I would actually say most of them don't understand feudalism at all. They write feudalism as if contemporaries never objected. There
I
are
think
peasant revolutions right the way through the feudal period.
I like George R. R. Martin's coined medieval Disneylands.
Yeah, I think that's fair. This is just not how feudal systems work. It just isn't. I don't tend to read this kind of fantasy. And I don't tend to read this kind of fantasy because they're often too rigid. They don't understand that within any system, there are get outs, there are flexibilities. And if there aren't, you end up with riots and revolutions. Feudalism is a system that the Normans introduced to the English in part as a way of controlling the English. I mean, I've talked about this before, and I always get it in the neck, but that doesn't make it any less true. England is a colonized state that still shows the effect of the colonizers and is still ruled by the same people who invaded. And you can see it in land tenure, and you can see it in leasehold. Other countries don't have leasehold properties, which return to their, in brackets, owner after 99 years. It limits fantasy because most people just don't understand how feudalism really works and doesn't understand that it can't be all encompassing. There's other stuff going on. It really isn't my kind of fantasy.
You described not liking books on literature courses that you've seen. So, how does canon limit genre's innovation?
By literature courses, the basic problem is that I have low taste. I like good, solid pulp. The truth is, if the sad puppies hadn't been such absolute idiots, I'd have agreed with them. I like my science fiction. I like adventure. I like parataxis. I feel differently about fantasy, where I do really like the beautifully written, quite small fantasy. But I'm not a fan of highbrow. I'm just not. It's why I did a history degree, not a literature degree. How does the canon limit? So here's the thing. I think it did, and I don't think it does now. I'm not sure that we have a canon at the moment, and I think that's excellent. I think we have series of canons. You know, if you want to read the best of African American writing, I'll point you to it. If you want to read the best of queer science fiction, I'll point you to it. But the idea that we now have a canon of science fiction writers in the way we did when I was a student is just laughable. It really is. I mean, yes, there are some big, very big names that we all refer to, but I don't think the question works anymore. Where I think it does sometimes work is when I've been teaching, I find mature students locked into the fiction they read when they were young, but they haven't really carried on reading, and they're still trying to write like 1950s or 1970s or 1990s writers, and it feels old-fashioned. Science fiction is a very newer-file genre. You have to keep up not just with science, but also with the way the fiction is being written.
In your novel, Spring Flowering, you write mimetic of Victorian England and blossoming queerness. I found it extremely attentive and more engrossing this way, very reminiscent of historicity in Dr. Beatrice Hitchman's All of You, Every Single One. How do you see those studying science and history decrease as those writing fiction on these topics increases? For example, the spunky peasant insulting the king with no penalty.
Oh, I see what you mean. The kind of sloppiness that has every 13th century woman be a feminist. I don't think creative writing should be a single subject honours. I really don't. But when I started teaching creative writing, the minor we offered was taken by students who did philosophy, history, sociology, various sciences, and the quality of the work was really high. The moment we were forced into going single subject or to combine only with English, we started getting very second-hand fiction. So I don't think you need to do a history degree or do a science degree. I do think that if you want to write, and if you want to write in any genre, you need to be studying more than creative writing. And what that studying means can vary, but you need to be reading really widely. You need to be reading not just fiction. I was listening to some quotes on a podcast today all about writing, and all the writers quoted talking about how much fiction you should read. You must read non-fiction as well, particularly if you're writing science fiction or historical fiction or crime fiction. You can't make it up. You can't assume that human beings are the same whenever. I read a children's book 2 years ago that I'd been waiting for quite eagerly, and I'm not going to give you the title because I don't want to insult the author, but it was set in 18th century London, and the number of mistakes this author made, from having their character having a new silk dress when they are lower class. Even the fact that it was a dress, nobody wore dresses in the 18th century. They wore costumes made up of pieces that were assembled each time you put them on. There was a very silly comment about she admired her new handmade dress. It's 1810. What else is it going to be? You know? And then at one point, the girl dresses up in trousers. It's like, this is a period in which a girl in trousers would be regarded as fair game. Only prostitutes wore trousers. So this idea that by dressing up as a boy or in boys' clothes you get more respect is a very late 19th century thing. So I really got terribly frustrated, and I'd waited quite eagerly for that. So yes, my advice is if you want to be a writer, even if you don't want to read books, watch documentaries, turn on the History Channel, turn on David Attenborough. Make sure that you are getting, I'd say you need to be reading about 5 or watching 5 non-fiction things for every fiction. Fiction will teach you how to write, but non-fiction will give you ideas of what to write. Otherwise, you're just churning secondhand stuff out all the time. So yeah, I found opinions on that.
I'll hear like tidbits of interviews of whether it's you or George R. R. Martin, where these little historical facts will open up so much for writing. And I've read a book on mushrooms called Entangled Life, which is phenomenal.
Is that the new Aliette de Bodard?
It's by Merlin Sheldrake.
Oh, no, yes, I've just realised which book you mean, and my husband's reading that at the moment.
I recommend.
Thank you. I was going to say something different, and I've completely forgot what it was. Oh, I know. Museums. Don't underestimate museums as a force. So, not Spring Flowering, but the short book I wrote before it, when I was first starting to write a little. My mother complained that I'd done way too much research. And actually, all I'd done was go around the local museum for an hour. You can get an awful lot out of popping into the local museum for an hour.
Yeah, I believe Karl Marx was the curator or something.
That's right. And even Spring Flowering was mostly based on the fact that I grew up in Birmingham. Yeah. A lot of it was based on my partner's family. Well, I'm quite working class, but his family owned a factory in Birmingham, and I based the family in Spring Flowering on his family.
It felt very representative and like real. Those attentions to detail go such a long way.
You don't necessarily need a lot of detail. You just need the right bit of detail in the right place.
Incidentally, do you believe the social genre and its main narratives are fit for fantasy and sci-fi?
What do you mean by social genre?
I don't know if that's the right term, but the social ideas encompassing like Gaskell and
social realism.
Dickens.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Have you read The Difference Engine by Bruce Sterling?
No.
You might find that interesting. It's based on the writing of Disraeli and Gaskell.
That's awesome.
The idea is that people like Percy Shelley and Lord Byron don't die young, and instead they become members of the House of Lords, and they support Charles Babbage in his attempt to create a calculating machine, and we get the computer revolution in the 19th century instead of the 20th. And it draws heavily on Disraeli's book Sybil. Generally, I'd say you can do anything you like with science fiction. I really like the work of Philip Reeve, who's a children's writer. He's written some books set on a world in which it's encompassed by a train, railhead, and he does some really interesting stuff about poverty and the proper poverty rather than faux poverty.
Yeah. What would you consider faux poverty?
Oh, your standard, somebody grows up poor with no education, but they speak with an Oxford accent somehow, and they appear to have all sorts of interesting ideas. This is much more representing what it's really like to grow up deprived of education, anxious about food, learning things as an adult rather than as a child. Diana Wynne Jones does a very good job of it too in a book called Drowned Amit. Oisin McGann in Ireland done some really interesting stuff with class. You can write social realist science fiction. And in fact, I would suggest that good science fiction and fantasy, really good science fiction and fantasy, has to partake of the social realist.
I appreciate it a lot because it keeps me grounded in what I'm struggling through and how I didn't read many of these books because I grew up poor. You can't miraculously understand genre fiction in general without reading. And I've really struggled with trying to grasp it, where I've only just built up to reading things
So,
like Pratchett.
can I say something? Because I can hear you're beating yourself up. There is a writer. She wrote a lovely book that I just adore called City of Pearl, Karen Travis. And Karen Travis is a journalist. Karen Travis has probably written more books than she has read.
That is
Okay?
probably what I will end up doing.
She was never a reader. John Courtney Grimwood didn't learn to read till he was about 8 or 9. What Karen said to me, because I met her when I was writing a book on children in science fiction. And remember, I'm an extreme sport reader. By the time I was 15, I was reading eight books a day. Okay?
Yeah.
And Karen really brought me down to earth and made me rethink, because what she said is that there are many ways to learn narrative. It doesn't have to be reading. You can learn narrative from graphic novels. You can learn narrative from game playing. You can learn narrative from television, from films. Don't you let yourself be intimidated by the people who go on and on about how you have to read. They do that because that's what they did. It's not the universal they think it is. I'm deadly serious about this. The problem with a lot of people in literature is that we are extremes and we don't realize we are. I have this conversation with librarians. I have this conversation with English teachers. We've got a tendency to behave like that god-awful sports teacher who couldn't understand why you didn't want to go out in the middle of the winter and play football or hockey.
I forced them to let me sit on the side.
I hurt my back quite badly as a teen, and this turned out to be splendid because it meant I could sit and read books instead. But I really want you to take that point seriously from me, okay?
Yeah.
Don't let people beat you up about it because they say these things unthinkingly. And I did a lot of work as a consequence of Karen's comments, looking at cognitive development. I looked at a lot of child development stuff. And it's quite different from the education research, which is often ignorant of cognitive development. Human beings develop their narrative strategies from the time they're about 3 or 4. By the time children are 4, they're starting to tell stories. Well, 4-year-olds haven't read novels. And if you do need to read more, short stories. If you struggle with concentration, get collections of short shorts. Science fiction loves the short.
Your a collection of like Gaskell and Oscar Wilde has been like phenomenally helpful in focusing and being able to engage with these authors without having read 300 pages.
You do not have to read 300 pages. When I was teaching, I never taught from novels because I wanted my students to be able to see different ways writers wrote on the same topic or different ways writers used a particular technique. Well, I'd have had to set them 900 pages for a week. The students are not going to do that. So I used to teach from Jonathan Strahan's yearly collection. He's the only one who does a mix of science fiction and fantasy. All the other collections are either or. So what I think, take a look at Jonathan Strahan's Year's Best. Okay, secondhand, because it doesn't matter which year you look at, it really doesn't. Focus on short stories. We are a field that absolutely supports the short story, which is
I love short stories.
Then write short stories, stuff novels. You do not have to read novels. You do not have to write them. There you are. I've given you permission.
Thank you.
Sometimes we need permission. And this is going way, way back. I started out in religious history. And in 1998, I had an appraisal. And the appraiser turned around to me and said, everything you publish in science, everything you write in science fiction gets grabbed. You are struggling to get published in religious history. Why not try just writing on science fiction for a year and see what happens? And by the end of the year, I had 2 contracts. And I remember that feeling of being given permission to do this thing. If you find reading novels hard work, but you enjoy short stories, focus on short stories. We have 20 years ago, this would have been difficult because the science fiction magazines collapsed. But thanks to the internet, there must be about 15 magazines that you could submit to.
That's very inspiring.
Good. Go away, be inspired. I want to see your name on a short story. And I'm serious. I want to see your name on a short story.
With how men like Rip Van Winkle frolic, let alone lords like Dunsany, to what degree is the escapist narrative patriarchal?
What a splendid question. And I was thinking exactly about this today. Somebody posted today about how his mother brought up 4 kids and seemed to have lots of time, even though she never spent much time with them. And I pointed out that half the bringing up of kids he didn't see because it's things like the laundry, the cooking. All of that's part of it. I do think that the being able to take time out to have an adventure is overwhelmingly patriarchal. There's a form called the club story, which is literally blokes sitting around in their club.
Yeah.
So the club story is literally men sitting in the gentleman club telling each other fancy stories. Okay?
Yeah, with cigars
Women don't get to do
and
that. Yeah, women don't get to do that. Working class people don't get to do that. People who are enslaved do not get to do this. So I do think the classic adventure fantasy is. It doesn't have to be. So Jo Walton's Life Load, a book told about an older woman within a family. It's a very gentle book. And it feels so radical to have somebody whose fantasy is constructed in the time between baking bread and keeping house. That the obligation, do you take your kids along on the adventure? Who's cooking the food? All of these things don't crop up a lot.
I really want to add this sense of being actually hungry within the story and struggling to clean your dishes and things like that.
And just struggling to cope. I mean, I've written one fantasy novel, which is not very good. I never submitted it anywhere. But I tried to build into it a bit more of the logistics of a quest. I send people off and there is somebody in charge of quartermastering and provisions. It doesn't just happen. And I think more consciousness of that is good. And I think modern fantasy is more self-conscious, but it is still quite noticeable when people who have wedges of privilege write books that remain unaware of their wedges of privilege.
Describing a lot of trees and flowers.
Yeah, and just don't see underneath. So one of my books is not on science fiction and fantasy at all. It's on the English Civil War, which is a reading hobby of mine. And there's a division in the non-fiction between the independent scholars who've written on this period and the university-trained people. And I started to notice that most of the military history was coming from the independent scholars, and that quite a lot of the academics did not understand the sheer difficulty of getting from one part of the country to another and finding your enemy when there are no maps, because this is just the period when people are starting to map things. So what you have instead are routes, which tells you to go from this town, then to this town, and then to this town. There's not what you would consider a map. And
it sounds horrifying, going around with just the names of cities.
Half the time you can't find the people you're trying to fight. That's why you need scouts. But not understanding the care and feeding of horses, the provisions. And I started to realize that this was why most of the academics didn't understand how Oliver Cromwell becomes such a big deal. So Cromwell goes on to effectively become King of England. Cromwell is adored by his men. Well, of course he is, because Cromwell was a farmer. Cromwell understands how to project manage. And the only person who points this out is a modern general who's written on Cromwell. So if you're in Fairfax's army, don't worry about the names, there's a decent chance you're going to arrive at your camp and there'll be no food and nowhere to put the horses and nobody set anything up. If you're with Cromwell, you will get there to find that he has sent an advance party. Stables will be set up, the food will be there, the camp will have been divided into sections, and the baggage train, which is where all the women and the doctors and things are, will already be ahead of you and ready.
I think a really hilarious example is Sun Tzu. In most of the book, it's just him begging them to give him food for horses.
And this is it. And a lot of that is often missing from fantasy. Okay, you should try some Diana Wynne Jones. She's very, very good. In Tough Guide to Fantasyland, which she wrote I need to back up slightly. She broke her neck. She ended up in the hospital. She read loads and loads of big fat fantasies and started finding them very funny. And she wrote Tough Guide to Fantasyland about all the really funny things she came across. And one of the comments she makes is a lot of Fantasyland treats horses as if they're bicycles. Nobody ever stops to feed, groom, or water a horse. I think you'd find that very funny. But she'd written some very good short stories, so you can find her collections.
How do mimetic urban writers, Gaskell, Dickens, Morris, push us to write about the city?
Can't bear Dickens. Not a fan. Skip
Is it
that one.
the sort of dismissive satire of fantasy with the 7-year-old?
I just don't like the way he writes, and I find him very sexist and just
Yeah.
really hard to deal with.
You talk about the idiot plot and how one scene of dialogue takes away hundreds of pages. Where can on-page arguments succeed where stream of consciousness doesn't?
So this is absolute preference, but obviously I love the monologues in Joanne Russ.
Yeah.
But that's where the one page of argument becomes a stylistic feature. It's not just dumping in argument, as somebody like Kim Stanley Robinson does. You want info dump? Try Kim Stanley Robinson. So writing about Russ originally wanted to be a playwright, and her one-page arguments are very theatrical. They're very performative. So if you're going to do something like that, you've got that option of the Brechtian stepping onto the stage and addressing the audience directly. You can also use the dialogue, which, if you're good enough at dialogue, what I've now said, can deliver a lot. You can stick in a fake newspaper article which reports on something. But there are ways to do it that still avoid the info dump.
Discussing Campbell's publishing, you mentioned it's nothing to do with who he was, but the environment around him. How can context, be it war, peace, and urban or rural landscapes, influence writers?
I think it's everything, really. I mean, my next book along is about a chap called Geoffrey Treves, who you won't know. He wrote children's fiction from the period of 1934 to 1990, and he was the middle son of a middle-class family from Nottingham, and most of his main characters are middle or younger sons. He tends to be urban because he grew up urban. His books are set in cities. He was educated at a traditional grammar school, and you can see that in the kinds of things he values. But he became very left-wing, and that led him to write some of the first books with both boys and girls, because up until his writing, books tend to be either with girls or with boys. And he adored history, so he becomes involved in that. And you can see all the things shaping him.
Growing up in a suburb was a nightmare.
Yeah.
It kind of limited my perspective, but somehow I still ended up writing urban. Like all my stories were about towering houses and the river down the middle of Vienna.
Well, that in a sense is being attracted to the thing you don't have. So the other side of Geoffrey Treves is that he got very involved in rambling and going for long country walks. And as a consequence, his landscapes are stunning. I think it's complicated. It's that mix of the stuff that shapes who you are and the stuff that is who you want to become. I think sometimes people give away things about themselves they don't expect to. One of the things I'm working on in my Joanne Russ book is the influence of her Jewishness. Now, she wasn't a believing Jew, and she almost never talked about being Jewish. But to me, there are recognizable things in there. And sometimes it's just a line. There's something that won't mean much to non-Jews. But in section 9, we have the Book of Joanna. And if you are Jewish, you have grown up with the Book of Ruth. You've grown up with the Book of Esther. These are quite specific books in the Old Testament in which a woman becomes active. It tells me something. So that kind of tell, I think, is there kind of underneath everything, whether you want it or not. And yet then again, there are the other things that you develop as you grow. So I think there's all sorts of stuff. And sometimes it can be what you don't do. I've mentioned my husband. I am actually queer. And one of the things I always found fascinating is that my gay students always knew, always. And they said it was the way I walked, my mannerisms, my obliviousness to men who are interested in me, which can really piss someone off, by the way.
Yeah.
And it's not, they said that I was giving commands to female students, because I wasn't. It was that I just don't present as a straight woman, even though I am femme presenting. I'm also not really femme. Every gay student I ever had just knew. So some of it just sticks to us.
I think also I just noticed queer people from how outwardly expressive and progressive they are in what they talk about.
It's an interesting one.
How does fiction tend to orientalize?
There's a terrible tendency to treat other people's cultures like a box of chocolates. I think with the growth of more and more own voices and more writing by diaspora writers, people are thinking much harder about this. I was rereading Bujold and realizing there are things I accepted, or Pratchett, that now put my teeth on edge.
Yeah.
So there's definitely ways of writing about people that were probably never acceptable, but now we're finding them unacceptable. But what I would say, or for me, I try to read diaspora writers, I try to read our own voices writers. I use the award lists from things like the Ignite Award to guide my reading, because I don't read as much as I used to. There's a time when I'd have read everything coming out. Well, I don't have the time, and there's now too much stuff coming out. But I use the award list to try to constantly broaden my reading.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope your dinner is nice.
I'm cooking it. It's mostly leftovers tonight. I want to see your first short story imprint. And seriously, don't let people intimidate you on that one. Just don't. There is the connection between reading fiction and writing it is not as strong as some people would like to have you think.